So you said barbarian earlier in reference to the
Yes.
Huns. One of the great sort of aha moments when I was reading the book is mentioning that the the image of the Mongol, the image of the barbarian in Western consciousness, is actually a manufactured one through a long line of propaganda. It's not necessarily true that, say, Attila the Hun or Genghis Khan was the most evil, bloodthirsty, murderous person in history. And it all started with Voltaire, who couldn't insult his own politicians directly, so he indirectly positioned them as the Mongols and the Khans. And perhaps you want to take it from there, but could you document how Genghis Khan's image was totally distorted for hundreds and hundreds of years up until your book, essentially?
Yeah. It's been a back and forth journey for his image, in history. Now, the people who are conquered almost never like the conqueror. I mean, that's just, I think, just kind of natural in history. And so there's always some lines of resistance. I mean, Russia, for example, has mostly been very anti Genghis Khan, anti-Mongolian history, very much. However, at the same time, there's always been a Russian group that was always very pro-Mongolian in their research, in their politics, and so on. So it works both ways. Also in China, I would say more pro-Mongolian in a way than Russia was, and yet there's always a group that's going to be anti-Mongol. I think that's true. But what happened after the conquest was that some people really embraced him very much. And I go back to the simple fact. He had 1 million people. He had an army of 100,000. How do you conquer 100 million people? If you conquer them, how do you rule them? It's not by force. The Mongols conquered many cities by force, but many cities joined the Mongols. And those that were conquered often realized that they benefited more because of the trade, the tax policies, and many other policies of Genghis Khan. You don't rule people for 100 years with an army of 100,000 people. I mean, the army did grew over time because in China, they added Chinese. In Iran or Persia, they added Persians, of course. But for the Mongols themselves, to have such a small population, they're not going to rule if there's no benefit to it. So the world benefited greatly from the Mongol rule, and many people realized it. I look back at the Persian writers, some of those were the most tolerant and the fairest towards Genghis Khan. They wrote some very positive things. Later, they turned very negative against the Mongols. And the Arab and Persian history later portrayed the Mongols as barbarians. You look at Europe, and you have on the one hand Russia from the beginning. They were dominated by the Mongols, but their ruling class had to accommodate. They had to go to Mongolia to get instituted into office. The great hero Alexander Nevsky, for example, was a great supporter of the Mongols. Today that's washed over in Russian history. And they sort of pretend, so many people pretend like, no, we were just conquered, it was the Mongol yoke, as opposed to the Golden Horde and all. So there was that tendency. At the same time, Geoffrey Chaucer, the first writer in the English language, the first one, called Genghis Khan the greatest lord there ever was. So people say, to me, you're a revisionist, you're coming in, you're not even a Mongol specialist, you're a revisionist who comes in. And I feel like, no, I'm upholding the tradition of Geoffrey Chaucer. There were other people along the way who were deeply impressed by the fact that it was under the Mongol Empire that so much out of China came, including the negative part, if you want to call it that, the gunpowder and explosives and artillery, but also printing, that it was printing that came out during this time. Also, the compass came out during this time. These are great revolutions that made possible in many ways the Renaissance, and there were always some people who recognized it from the beginning. Certainly Marco Polo. I mean, everything he said was positive. And so, yeah, then we had this narrative start with people such as Voltaire, going back to the barbarian image of the Mongols and all. And unfortunately, it also, it had been preceded by some better work, I think. And that was that the first novel ever written by Genghis Khan was written by a French woman. And she was a Huguenot who had been forced out of France because of her religion. And she had to work as what today we'd call a nanny, taking care of children. And she wrote in her past time. And she wrote a novel. She had no history. She had no access to much about him, but she knew some things. And I believe that it was because of the religious freedom issue probably that she chose him. And she portrayed him as this great gallant person. It was a bestseller in many languages in Europe at that time. And also at the same time, then we had a very great scholar in France, Petit de la Croix. He had been an ambassador, you would say, in Turkey, and he knew Persian and Turkish and Arabic. He was quite a gifted scholar. And he wrote the first true biography on Genghis Khan. And it was called Genghis Khan the Great. Genghis Khan the Great. I mean, he started off right there. And that was one of the favorite books, for example, of Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah, I love that anecdote.
United States. He bought many copies of it. He gave it to people. He gave it to his own granddaughter to read. He was very much impressed by this book. So there's always this tradition that recognized Genghis Khan for what he was and the Mongolian people for what they did. But then there was always the created, and I think it was made worse in the scientific revolution, when they wanted to find scientific reasons to dislike the Asians. So they renamed all Asians Mongols. You know, they called them the Mongol race. So you had the African race and the European race and the Mongol race. And then there was also the scientists who then decided, okay, if we, the white people of Europe, are the superior race to the world, how can we have children who are not superior? We have children who are born with things like what we would today call Down syndrome or with other kinds of handicaps. How can that be? And they came up, well, it's because the Mongols raped white women when they came through, and these children are throwbacks to the Mongols. They're Mongoloids.
Mongoloids, yeah, exactly.
That's how science and medicine were used to justify a virulent form of racism. But I look back to Petit de la Croix. I look back to people such as Chaucer. I think of these people and Marco Polo as having given a much better view, and I try to emphasize that in my life and in my work.
I think the way you started that was a way that I've never thought about it before, but such a clear way to almost dispel the myth that it was a rule through fear. How can 100,000 warriors rule over fear over 100 million people? The logistics of it just doesn't make sense. I don't care how good the warriors are. And so that's a really good way to put it. And then you obviously you go on to emphasize the benefits of being under Mongol rule, right? You know, you get access to trade, so you increase the prosperity of your people. You aren't going to be subject to any sort of, I don't know, what would you call it? You're not going to be subject to their religion. You can still practice your own religion. Very important one. One you dedicate an entire book to, but how Genghis Khan was he allowed freedom of religion, really, for all of the people that he was that was subject to him. Could you, just to round out this point, could you please tell the anecdote of the Indian man in prison writing letters to his daughter? I forget the name of him right now that I'm asking the question, but that really stood out to me as well as another person throughout history who had maybe recognized Genghis Khan as this amazing figure in history and not just a bloodthirsty murderer.
Yes, that was Nehru, the father of modern India, and the father also of Indira Gandhi. And he was writing those letters from a British prison to his daughter, Indira Gandhi. who was later, of course, herself assassinated, unfortunately, with a sectarian issue. And he was defending Genghis Khan and the Mongols because he recognized that, first, it showed the contribution of Asia people to the world, but also he was trying to give a strong message to his own daughter and to anybody else that he might be listening to him about the need for India to overcome the great diversity of languages and religions and ethnicities and castes that it had. And I think he saw Genghis Khan as a good model for that. And so his words about it were very positive. And then from the moment of its independence, India has been one of the staunchest, steadiest ally of Mongolia. It has never wavered. And India is not a rich country at all. But India still, this year, for example, it donated vaccines to Mongolia and to Cambodia. They always step in to try to help, especially in the case of Mongolia, but also with Cambodia and a few other countries. And when India became independent, well, the first thing they did was they had an academic conference on the secret history, and they began the translation. Unfortunately, they did not have access to the Mongolian scholars to translate from Mongolian, so they translated it from Chinese. And so it wasn't it wasn't necessarily accurate in every respect, but they were the first to do it. And they were a poor country. To pay for something like that, it showed their respect for this part of Asian history. And it's the kind of the globalism of Genghis Khan, that he was somebody who tried to unite the world, even though in part by force, but also in part by these other policies. And so, and some other countries, such as Japan that you mentioned, and even Korea, they have been much more positive in history towards the Mongols, even though both were invaded, successfully in the case of Korea, unsuccessfully in the case of Japan. They've been much more positive. So India, Japan, and Korea have had much steadier positive images and cooperation and help for Mongolia than many of the Western countries.
Yeah. And on this topic, it is worth mentioning, though, also that Genghis Khan also and his Mongols were extraordinarily ruthless to take a city, and also to perhaps create fear in the survivors, so the bad propaganda would spread, and people would know that when Genghis Khan comes knocking on your door, you better let him in. Otherwise, terrible things are going to happen to you. You know, there's a particularly gruesome scene that I remember where the Mongols have a feast. They've laid boards over the piles of dead people, and they have a feast sitting on the boards with people dying underneath them. And that, you know, maybe has been embellished throughout history and mightn't have been exactly as it occurred. But it is it is the type of scenery that could spread that fear and could you know, spread the bad propaganda to make sure that you become servile when this man does knock on your door. So it's also worth mentioning that as well, of course.
Yeah, to speak to that scene in particular, this is a scene that was recorded by a Christian, a Western Christian Roman Catholic priest who said that happened. And I don't know of any other source, and so I cannot deny it or cannot confirm it. But the Mongols, the Mongols, and this person did not see it. He reported it. And what the Mongols were very good at exactly what you said, propaganda. But I want to go directly to the point about brutality in war and say, yes, there is no war ever that has not been brutal. None. And yes, when the Mongols conquered, they conquered efficiently, which means also brutally. However, they had a very structured system. And there are some people, I think like Attila the Hun, I will not defend him, and even like Tamerlane to some extent. They seem to just sort of conquer and all. But the Mongols had a simple system. They had to send in an ambassador. They had to the people and announce to them that if they surrender, no one will be hurt. No one. And their taxes will not change. I mean, that's a very strange thing. And then a few other things like that. But if you resist, you will be killed. So that was the first step. And then if the people fought and the Mongols won, of course, as they did every single time, they won, then the Mongols killed the elite right away. They killed them all the rulers. Genghis Khan had been betrayed early on by some rulers whom he let live. And after that, no, the upper class is wiped out. There is no need for them. If they cannot defend their own people, then what good are they going to be to the Mongols? But every person who had a skill, if you could weave, if you could speak languages, if you could read and write, if you could make pottery, if you could do anything, translation, even if you could do translation, anything, you were saved. You were saved automatically. Now, you may not have much control over your life because you're not being granted the same freedoms that you would have if you had surrendered. So he was quite fair. I feel like you compare that to what was going on in Europe at the time, he was extremely fair. But then what happened, he had no people to leave behind. He could not leave behind a governor. He couldn't leave behind an occupied army. He had too few people. So he would appoint local people to then take over administration. If they then revolted against him, he came back and he killed everybody. That's true. And it happened in several cities. One of the most famous was the city of Merv in what's now Turkmenistan.
And they murdered all the cats and dogs as well, right? Like it was an absolute...
Yeah, now...
Oh, that was a different one.
I do not know if that's true. No. That is said by the Persian chroniclers, yes. But again, we have this thing with the Mongols that when I say they killed everyone, they usually would allow a certain number of people, about 10%, to escape.
Okay.
Because they spread terror. And they wanted the terror to be spread, and they encouraged the spreading of these tales. I cannot imagine that why would you take the time to kill a bunch of dogs and cats? I mean, first of all, if you really, the slaughter of people at that time, it's not like we're so efficient today with bombs. I mean, each one had to be, it's like, could you really kill 100,000 cows in a day? It's almost that difficult.
Yeah.
You know? And so I don't know that cats and dogs true, not true, I don't know. But the Mongol propaganda was great, and then they would exaggerate their own numbers. Sure. They let people say, oh yeah, killed 1 million people. There was no city of 1 million people in Mongol, never. But they would say, yeah, he killed 1 million people. You know? And so the Mongols didn't try to control it. They used propaganda, and then in the end, it has certainly affected his image. But you look at his priority was to save the lives of his soldiers. That was his first priority. He did not want to risk them in a battle. Yeah. He did not want to risk them in going in on anything unnecessary. And if you look at the American bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it was to save American soldiers' lives. They sacrificed the lives of Japanese women and children, and perhaps justified, perhaps not. Many people have different opinions. But that is a fact of a modern civilized country. And I think almost any country would probably do the same. And that's what happened in the time of Genghis Khan. But with 100,000 men, you really can't kill that many people.